So Naomi is an immigrant who comes to the new country because she's starving, has a new life. But then her husband and her sons die, and she decides to go back to the original country. It's a patriarchal society. The 2 daughter-in-laws are supposed to come with her, but she says, don't. This will be too difficult. This will be too hard. Stay here where your mother's family is. And Ruth, the daughter-in-law, says, which I think this is one of the most beautiful things in all of Scripture, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. I love this. I love it. It actually makes me teary because it exquisitely expresses what it looks like to belong to another person, not for economic reasons, not for family ties, but because you love that person. Belonging is a profoundly holy thing, something that we really desperately need to embrace now in 2025. I think belonging is the antidote to tribal thinking. Tribal thinking is the people on the inside are safe and good, and everybody outside is not to be trusted because there's a scarcity of resources or because we're not safe. Belonging's different. So the heart has an intelligence. We know this. And if we listen and rest in our heart, it will guide us. And the heart will tell you who the people are that are yours to love. And they might have nothing to do with biology. In the mystery, somehow you belong to them and they belong to you. Can you think of somebody in your life that for whatever reason you know you don't have anything in common, you don't have any blood ties, but they're yours to care for? Often they're a vulnerable person. Maybe it's a rescue dog, you know? It's yours to do. Here's the thing. In our modern society, the world is so enormous now that we're becoming very distant from one another and anonymous in our communities. We're often transient. You know, I speak for that. I've lived in so many different places. And few of us have relationships with landscape and the creatures and the people there that go back generation after generation. Vermont is a little bit healthier than other places are. We still have that, I think it's because of the harsh winters, relationship with our neighbors. But the world in general is becoming more cold and anonymous, and meanwhile, loneliness is reaching epidemic proportions. This is where sacred belonging is very helpful for us to pray with and consider in our thinking. I think people from long ago would be shocked at how detached we are from our communities, from the creatures, and from the earth herself. Earlier, when I was playing the guitar, we heard the words of St. Francis from 800 years ago, where he talks about Mother Earth as the mirror of God. The mirror of God. Now, there's a reason that he uses the word mirror. Just like if you hang out with me, you'll hear my friend Christine's words shimmer. The reason that Francis used this word so much was because his dear soul friend, Clare of Assisi, found the imagery of a mirror profoundly helpful to her in her faith. This is one of her prayers. She wrote this, what I'm about to read out, to another abbess. Have you heard of Clare of Assisi? Good, I'll tell you a bit more about her in a minute. She writes, "Place your mind before the mirror of eternity. Place your soul in the brilliance of glory. Place your heart in the figure of the divine substance. And then through contemplation, allow your entire being to be transformed into the image of the Godhead itself, so that you too may feel what God's friends feel, and that you may taste the hidden sweetness that God has reserved for those who love God. I hear Clare's wisdom in Francis's song. I can tell that his connection with her was very, very important in his own faith. And Franciscan friar Richard Rohr, who's a very famous Franciscan, he says, and I agree with him, that the Franciscan movement would never have stabilized and lasted if it wasn't for Clare's friendship and presence. For one, Clare outlived Francis by 26 years. She was quite younger than him, and Francis died young. And because at that time, when Clare and the other women decided to join Francis and the brothers, it wasn't safe or allowed for them to go out into the streets of the newly forming cities and beg. They lived in enclosures that were separate, away from the people. And it meant that they very quickly got ignored. The friars, within a generation, became heads of universities. These beggars in the streets suddenly became very important clerics. But the nuns, the sisters, stayed very true to this commitment to simplicity and poverty. Taoist path, really. Richard Rohr says, Francis's radical poverty was glossed over and deemed impossible or quietly rejected by most of the male followers. Only Clare and her sisters found a way for the radical life of Francis to be actually lived with freedom and joy. Right, so the reason I share that is to say that what I'm about to talk about, soul friendship, isn't just a nice personal spiritual practice to make us close to God. It really helps us where the rubber hits the road in walking our talk as people of faith. Francis and Clare of Assisi had a very special, intimate soul connection. It ignited and strengthened each other's faith. They were tenderly intimate, but respectfully separate. Now, this is a way that Francis was in the world with the animals. This is why we associate him with blessing animals and caring for the environment. He showed compassion and openness towards worms on the road and birds and animals. There was a way that he delighted in other people with compassion and openness. One of the most telling stories of this was about when he met the Sultan of Egypt. So Francis was accompanying the soldiers going to the Fifth Crusade. He was trying to stop them from fighting. They didn't listen to him. He went all the way at the battlefield and they were still determined to fight. So what does Francis do? He walks straight out into no man's land and gets captured by the enemy side. And he's marched off to the Sultan. And he meets the Sultan and the two of them become close friends really quickly. Meanwhile, Francis has disappeared for a whole week. They must have thought he was dead. So they were very surprised when he came back talking about the good man, the Sultan. And interestingly, years later, when the Muslims took control of the Holy Land, the only Christians that were allowed in to Jerusalem were the Franciscans. You know, the impact of that connection he had with the Sultan lasted a very long time. Here's a quote by Peace Pilgrim. Love is the greatest power on earth. It conquers all things. One in harmony with God's law of love has more strength than an army. For one need not subdue an adversary can be transformed. All right, so we're talking about 800 years ago, a town called Assisi in Italy. I've never been there, but I take great inspiration from both Clare and Francis. I would say that I belong to them, even though they died so long ago, and I even wear a Franciscan towel. Francis and Clare were a very unlikely couple. He was the son of an up-and-coming merchant cloth trader. He was a party boy in his youth. He rode off to war, got captured. He had really shiny armor on, so they realized they could get a ransom out of him. He was immediately captured. Spent a year in a medieval dungeon. Eventually, his family paid the ransom and brought him back to Assisi. But he came back with trauma and PTSD, and as so often happens when our young men and women come back from war. It took Francis years of wandering in the countryside, begging for food, talking with the animals and birds to find a new way of being. Clare, on the other hand, seemed to be born ready. She was a noble woman, right? Her family owned a palace and a castle in Assisi. She was born in the year 1194. And she was raised with very strict standards. And she was the oldest daughter, so she was taught how to run the household. There were so many things that Clare knew that Francis didn't have a concept of, like how to care for the sick or how to manage conflict in a household. Francis was a carefree troubadour who had very little idea of how to create a religious order. He wasn't trying to create a religious order. All he was doing was responding to the Bible and to Christ by imitating Christ. And then people came to him and said, "We want to do this too." There was a handful of them in the early days, and one of the first people who came was Clare. As a teenager, Clare had heard Francis preaching in the cathedral in Assisi. And at 17, just before she would have been married off, she ran away in the middle of the night in a dramatic escape to join Francis and the brothers. So she was 17, he was 30. And as you can imagine, Clare's family were not happy about this, especially when 16 days later, one of Clare's sisters also eloped and ran away to join her. The family tried very violently and forcefully to bring the young ladies home. God had other plans, though. And the brothers created a simple dwelling for Clare and her sister Agnes, a place called San Damiano on the outskirts of Assisi. And other women came to join them, including, further down the line, another sister and Clare's mum. It's important to remember that Clare outlived Francis by 26 years. And because Clare and the woman could not go out in society, their way of life stayed completely powerless and mendicant, meaning begging. Francis and Clare rarely met each other in person, but it's clear they shared a unified vision, and their connection ignited each other's faith. There's a lovely story that was handed down to us. It's a ye olde story from The Little Flower of St. Francis. Here it goes. One day, Francis, inviting Clare to dine with him and the brothers at St. Mary's of the Angels. During the meal, St. Francis began to speak about God with such sweetness that they all were in rapture of God. And while they were sitting there in rapture, with their eyes and hands raised to the sky, the people of Assisi and the surrounding area saw that St. Mary's of the Angels, including the convent, and the forest next to it were all going up in flames. So the people arrived in great haste to put the fire out. However, all that they saw was St. Francis and Clare and their companions transfigured in contemplative prayer, seated around a humble table. I love this. It's the best example of where two or more gather, spirit erupts into flames. It's a beautiful Pentecost image. In the Celtic Christian tradition, which Francis was influenced by, there's actually a direct line from a monk called Columbanus that went to Italy and founded a monastery, and young Francis ended up in that monastery scrubbing pots. So in the Celtic Christian tradition, there's something called anam cara. It means soul friend. soul friend. It was a vital and important spiritual practice to keep the monastics in check because they didn't have bishops presiding over them. If they were in an abbey, there would have been an abbot, a male or female abbot, that they reported to, but people back then, I think, had tremendous freedom, and the society that the Celts had was more like villages. It was agrarian, there was no empire, there was no kind of police force and church hierarchy. It was a clan-based system based around families and religious life of the monasteries. In the early Celtic church, an anam cara was a person who acted as a teacher, companion, and spirit guide. But they weren't necessarily above you or older than you or wiser than you. St. Bridget of Kildare is said to have said, I mean, this is 1,500 years ago, so who knows what she really said, but this is attributed to her. Go forth and eat nothing until you get a soul friend. For anyone without a soul friend is like a body without a head. It is like the water of a polluted lake, neither good for drinking nor washing. This is the person without a soul friend. Water can go stagnant. We can go stagnant. There's all sorts of stories about the Celtic monks and nuns and their soul friends, and their special relationship with animals too. Let's not forget that. So I believe that we are all wired to have an inner compass. Our body knows when we're lying. You feel it in your belly. We have an ability to recognize truth in our biology, in our body, in our heart. But the thinking self can get off kilter. And Clare's analogy of a mirror is very helpful here, because without the feedback of the interaction of other people, we do not have a realistic concept of ourselves. Desmond Tutu said, "In my culture, there is no such thing as a solitary individual. But in our culture, there are solitary individuals." And with the introduction of AI and algorithms and social media, we are mirrored back our thoughts and our opinions or our fears in a way that's not balanced through the reality of a lived relationship with another person. You know, I can have a really good relationship with my neighbor who is much more conservative politically than I am, because he has bees and we share a hillside and his harvest is my harvest, and the Japanese beetles that destroy his plants are the same ones that destroy my ones. There's something about the reality of a lived relationship that's very important. And this is important in our faith also. That's what anam cara is about. Anam cara helps us know ourselves. And unlike a therapist relationship, it is reciprocal, it's two-way, even if you're not peers. You don't have to be the same gender or age or status to have that anam cara quality. For example, two people that I consider anam cara, one of them is an abbess that runs a successful online abbey, and another one is 10 years younger than me, somebody who's struggling to get housing security and pay off their student loans. Neither of these people are peers for me, but my relationship with them has a quality of honesty, and I don't need things from them like I do with a normal friendship. It's not about let's go and have fun together. It's more about let's sit down and be real. Let's be real with one another. Plato said, "One of the greatest privileges of the human being is to become a midwife, to birth the soul in another person." Anam cara, soul friend, is a catalyst to this process. Because in a very real way, we create the growth and conditions for healing that another person needs by witnessing them without judgment, by witnessing them with love, by belonging to them, just like we heard Ruth belonging to Naomi. John O'Donohue says, he's got a whole book on anam cara. If you're interested in this topic, I would send you to John O'Donohue. John O'Donohue writes, once you start to awaken, no one can ever claim you again to the old patterns. It's a really beautiful thing. Now, people often ask me, how can I find an anam cara, Simon? And I would have to say that this question is the wrong way round. Remember what I was saying about Francis and the Sultan and his relationship with animals? If we drop deep into our being, if we drop deeper than our wounded history and can access the part of us that was never wounded and is also fully healed, if we can really drop into the depth of our presence and listen with our hearts, then we can relate to other people in a way that's more true. Within us, and I would say within our heart, deeper than the harm that's been done and the trauma, deeper than that, which is the heart of a young child that's not been tarnished. There is an openness to life and to others, an expectation of the best, and a playfulness. Can we show up with that part of us in relationship with trusted people? Of course, Francis found anam cara in Clare and the Sultan because it was an expression of his depth of presence. And I'm bringing this up because yesterday was Francis's feast day, and being an informal Franciscan, I wanted to honor that. But I also think that as I was saying about loneliness and algorithms, and it's something that we really need. It can really help us in our relationship with the holy. Where two or more are present, Christ really is present. And it's not unique to like the Celtic monks. Think about the Book of Joy and Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. That's a wonderful book. If you listen to that, you get to glean so many of the gifts of their faith that they sparked in each other. How many of you have read that, the Book of Joy? It's gorgeous. I'd like to end with a lovely quote by John O'Donohue from the book Anam Cara. In the caring, loving presence of anam cara, soul friend, you are understood as you are without mask or pretension. The superficial half-truths of social acquaintance fall away, and you can be as you really are. Love allows understanding to dawn. Where you are understood, you are home. Friendship is the nature of God. Friendship is the nature of God. I'd like you to think about that over the week. Thank you for listening.